Hi. So we kind of wanted to make a short reflection video after having visited the plantation. I know I talk a lot of shit on the gram, but I'm incredibly passionate about social justice and women's rights and being a responsible human being. And this was an incredibly important experience that I got to share with the most lovely human I know. And we just had so many thoughts during the tour, and we kind of wanted to air them out a little bit. So the first thing that we noticed, very much so, is that we were the only people of color in our group during the tour, and Nafisa made some really good observations about that, tied to our privilege of being able to rent a car and drive out for an hour to this location. What else did you say?
Well, just that there's like financial privilege, of course, but then there's also the privilege of being South Asian and an immigrant in this country, on this land that isn't ours, and to engage with this history of, you know, suffering and resilience that isn't ours either, which is Black history. And of course, you know, in terms of land and culture that was wiped out, also like indigenous people. So I think as South Asians, as immigrants, we have to grapple with that, the privilege that we have to be here, and to learn about this and to be humbled by it, without having, you know, having that intergenerational trauma and history.
Yeah. But also the flip side of that is both Nafisa and I made a very conscious decision to want to come to the plantation. I think that we were also talking about a lot of non-Black POCs in our communities, or not even in our communities, just like people we know don't want to engage in this history and don't really want to know because they had nothing to do with it. It wasn't a part of their lives, their lineage of any kind. And so I think it's incredibly important as a non-Black POC to recognize your place in American history and to want to know these things. And hopefully that serves a purpose for your, you know, intentional existence in these spaces, and helps you be a better ally to Black people. I don't know. I feel like that whole thing was very evident to me. Is just like, as the only two women of color on the tour, we were just the experiences that we were having,
And non-Black people of color that we saw, at least amongst like 3 tour groups. I think we saw some Asian Americans, like Chinese American visitor, like a family, but those were really the only non-Black POC we saw. And, you know, I think if you're going to live in this country, you have to learn about Indigenous and African American history and like Black history here. And so if our communities, and, you know, I talk shit about South Asian communities a lot because we are the worst.
They're the worst. We don't take we don't hold ourselves accountable for the shitty behaviors that we engage in towards Black communities. Very much so. And one of the and I didn't talk to you about this when it was happening, but our tour guide, who was incredibly just amazing, she is doing such a good job, she was talking to us about the sugarcane that the plantation, that was the business of this plantation specifically, and she was telling us how the sugarcane itself was so rich with sugar and sugar water that it would bend over because it was so full of sugar water. And there was an example of that on the plantation, and all of us were walking, the few people were walking over to look at the sugarcane, and it was really an intense experience for me. She walked over and broke open the sugarcane for us to try, and that was really okay, here's another Black person doing the work for us. And then she was very here, take it, eat it. And Nafisa and I are South Asian, and sugarcane is such a huge part of our culture back home. I don't know, it was just a really intense moment Like, this black woman opened up the sugar cane, had us taste it, and we were very familiar with how to eat it, right? Like, she didn't have to tell us how to eat it. She was telling the white people, like, chew on it, but don't swallow it. I don't know. It was, like, very intense.
Yeah, it was like a moment of connection and also dissonance.
Yeah.
Right? Because, like, that experience was ours to have in that moment in terms of connecting to something that is such an integral part of, like, our childhoods and like growing up and our culture. But
it's really,
but we have nothing, like, we don't have ties to the history here.
yeah.
So I think when we visit these places, we have to grapple with that and what it means to learn and experience things that aren't yours, and be okay with the fact that, like, we're learning and we're going to be humbled by everything that we don't know.
And hopefully pay it forward,
And
right?
pay it
like,
forward,
how am I going to talk about racism with my parents, my family, my community, my children, inshallah, one day, you know? It's just really funny. Like, my mom's nickname for my brother is Gandiri, which is sugarcane. And so just, like, all of those thoughts were happening in that very specific moment. And so so that was one thing we wanted to talk about. And then also just non-Black POC, please engage in United States history, specifically about Black history. And I just feel like we don't talk about it enough, and we absolutely should. Humble, gentle advice is to go to these places that are very difficult to be in, because we are, quote unquote, like, outsiders of this history. It has nothing really to do with us, because we never were a part of it, but we're here now, and we're very much a part of it now. And so when you are speaking in Ebonics and using the N-word, which a lot of South Asians still fucking do, and it's so infuriating, or, you know, you listen to rap and hip hop and engage in Black culture, if you are doing that, you are also very responsible of knowing where it's coming from and the implications of Black history and how it plays out in our culture now, and how we talk to people and engage in those communities or not, or try to be good allies. I don't know. I feel like I'm always struggling and always learning. I don't think it's ever going to stop. But that was something I really wanted to talk about. It's just like, okay, you're going to, you know, speak a certain way and act a certain way. And obviously, like, this applies to me too. Like, I think I very much am a consumer of Black culture, and just knowing my place is so important. And I want to be able to communicate that. This is how I'm trying to pay it forward for now, at least.
Yeah, and I think, so we learned a couple of things today, and I made a slip up on my social media posts earlier because I was so excited to share some history that we learned last night on the Ghost Tour. We learned about Marie Laveau, who is now my new personal hero and historical figure.
Incredible.
But I did use the word as I was, like, writing about how she redistributed her income to free people and slaves. I should have used the word the phrase enslaved people. And so for us, especially as, you know, brown people, I think we have to pay attention to these types of things and listen when we're told
by Black people.
Yeah,
we're told by Black people,
and
don't fucking use the
educators
N-word.
and scholars to, like, use certain terminology that is more respectful and that gives agency to people who, a historical agency, at least, to people who didn't have a choice. Like, they weren't immigrants. You know, a lot of times we talk about America as a country of immigrants, and really it isn't. America, the U.S., is a country that committed genocide against indigenous people and captured Black people and brought them over. They had no choice in the matter. So
slavery was not a choice.
Yeah, slavery was never a choice, and so we have to be mindful of that. We have to not use the word slaves even in a conversation about, like, history. And, you know, we're, like, I think I'm always growing and learning too. So I had to be kind of mindful of that. What were some other things that we learned, like, big salient historical facts or lessons?
A lot about religion, which, you know, was very surprising to me. Just the way that Christianity evolved in this area, I guess, specifically, where it was specifically Roman Catholic. And then after, 1860 something, it kind of merged into other things and combined a bunch of different indigenous practices within Catholicism. I think we learned that last night, too.
Syncretic religion, I guess, was the phrase that our awesome guide, tour guide Sydney, used, which was the combination of kind of like
West African,
Orisha, and Yoruba religions and practices.
And native practice, indigenous practices to the United States, and then also Catholicism or whatever kind of Christianity. So religion was a pretty interesting new point for me to learn.
And especially in the American South and in states like Louisiana, you have a lot of African Americans who have Native American ancestries because they belong to what were called Maroon societies. And I learned about this through like history classes years ago, but it was a good kind of reminder that these communities kind of lived beyond the swamps, and they were frequently integrated societies of
Indigenous
escaped
right,
enslaved people and indigenous people who lived together and had families and children together, and they lived separately in spaces away from white people. And that's where some of the syncretic religious practices come from, the Maroon societies and integration between
and
indigenous.
also our host guide was telling us about how some Black people will say frequently, like, oh, I have Indian in me, which relates to those, or like comes from those Maroon communities. Learned a lot about
the largest slave revolt happened.
The largest slave revolt happened here, literally on this plantation was a part of the largest slave revolts, and we unfortunately saw the consequences of what it was to lose that revolt. Just learned a lot, and feeling incredibly humbled, as Nafisa said, by the whole experience, and really grappling with our place in American history, and really wanting to talk to South Asians about Black history and how it should be mandatory in schools. Like she was talking about, curriculums are specifically, educators have specifically eliminated Black history from curriculums in schools, and how they don't teach the 13th Amendment in its entirety. So stuff like that.
She's talking about the Daughters of the Confederacy too, and this is like a real conspiracy theory because it really happened. But this organization of women who came from wealthy kind of Southern families, like plantation money. They were the ones who erected these statues glorifying the Confederacy all around the American South, and they were also the ones involved with the erasure of Black history from curriculum throughout the South. And as somebody who grew up in South Carolina, I can say that, like, I can attest to the fact that, like, I didn't learn shit in my K through 12 education. I felt like we talked about Franklin Delano Roosevelt a lot and the New Deal, but like we did not learn Black history or Indigenous history, and that's because of a real life conspiracy. These institutionalized racism. These women worked their ways systemically into school boards so that they could influence curriculum. That's real, and that's terrible. And I think a lot of the lessons and a lot of what we're taught about like the real history of this country makes me question but also feel comfortable.
So anyway, my iPhone overheated and stopped making the video, and we just wanted to close out by just reiterating: educate yourselves, be nice to people, talk to your family about racism. There's so much anti-blackness in the South Asian community. It's repulsive and appalling. And
Always be learning.
Always be learning. Don't take up space that you're not really. How would you say that? Like if you are in a black space, don't take up more room than they are giving you.
Yeah, I think that's important. Thanks for restating.
Yeah, of course. And then I just want to close out by saying that I am wearing a Beyonce Knowles shirt that Nafisa bought me years ago, paying homage to her mama, Tina Knowles, who is a Louisiana Creole. This was the most perfect day to wear it, I think, personally. So thank you for the present. And thank you for hearing us out. Just two brown girls trying to be responsible human beings, you know?
Let us know if you have thoughts.
And if they're bad thoughts, probably keep them to yourself.